Welcome to the Center for Ethics and Human Values final conversation around research ethics panel of the semester. I'm Dana Howard. I'm a member of the Center for Bioethics in the College of Medicine and also in the philosophy department. And this program is supported by the College of Public Health and the College of Medicine, as well as, of course, the Center for Ethics and Human Values. And we're really excited for this topic of conversation. In some ways, I feel like this is the kind of thing that many of you in the audience probably struggle the most with. And these are kind of difficult conversations to have with your collaborative team. And so we're going to be talking about giving authors their due, the ethics of co-authorship and authorship order. And in some ways, there's been a lot of focus in the literature, and when you think about research misconduct, on who is actually an author, who gets to be an author and who doesn't, and when people don't actually contribute and then they become authors, those sorts of questions, or ghost authorship. And in some sense, those are really important questions, of course, but a lot of the other sorts of issues of when we all know who the authors should be, there's still a lot of questions related to power dynamics, related to really giving people their due credit for the work that they've done, about author order. So that's sort of the focus of our discussion today. And we have two really exciting panelists. We have Elise Smith, who's an assistant professor of preventative medicine and population health at the University of Texas Medical Branch. Elise is a bioethics scholar with a background in philosophy, law, and social science. She has written prolifically about how to navigate collaborations, especially interdisciplinary collaborations, but also thinking about the ways in which gender and the global South, global North, your sort of social positioning and how that affects authorship issues. So welcome, Elise. And then we also have Joanna Meets, who is assistant professor and is the publishing and repository services librarian at Ohio State. And Joanna has expertise and experience in helping authors negotiate power dynamics, ensuring all of those who do work get appropriate credit, and all those sorts of nitty-gritty issues that come within the OSU community. So welcome, Joanna. And just to let you know what the order of operations is for this next hour, we're going to start with some sort of introductory remarks from Elise and then from Joanna. And then I have a set of questions that I kind of thought would be useful to frame some of the conversation that we'll talk through. But we're going to definitely try and have the last 15 to 20 minutes be questions from the audience. So if you look at the bottom corner of your screen, you should have a Q&A symbol. Please write down questions whenever they come up during the course of the conversation, and we'll definitely get to them as much as we can at the end of the last third of the conversation. So to no further ado, I'm going to cede the floor to Elise, and we'll start our conversation. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Dana. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to having this type of conversation with different scholars and researchers facing some of these issues. So I will share my screen. Do you see my slides?
We do.
Great. So I will do this as quickly as possible. I'll try to put everything in 10 minutes. That way we could get to the discussion quicker. So I was asked to quickly go over some of the research I have done, or rather what I have looked at in my research trajectory. When I started looking at authorship, I started looking at authorship from a very conceptual standpoint, being an issue of fairness. So what is fair distribution within a team? Then I realized, okay, fairness is all great from a philosophical perspective, but in the real world, people were coming to see me and saying, well, how do I navigate these team dynamics? How do I even talk about authorship? How do I even face the guy that has a lot of power over my career and all this? So I looked more at team dynamics afterwards. And finally, I went more into the social dynamics of science, which means the only reason authorship has the power or challenges it has is because of its meaning within the scientific system. So authorship is a form of social capital. It has a lot of value, and that's why people compete over it. So this broader notion of social dynamics of science is what I've been working on more recently. So when authors need to make decisions about authorship, there's two main questions that are very simple that they need to answer. Answering them is always more challenging. The first is, who is author and how to define that? So authors are individuals who have made substantial contributions to the reported work and agree to be accountable for these contributions. So this is a very, very, very general definition. There's different specific definitions in different fields. We also mentioned authorship order. So authorship order is different depending on the field you're in. It's based on the norms of the research field. In health sciences, for example, it's often in decreasing order of contribution, value of contribution. So the first author is generally the person that has contributed the most, or at least is perceived to have made the most valuable contribution. And sometimes the senior PI is at the end, sometimes not. So there's all kinds of different conventions that are used. However, in a lot of these orders, in a lot of these decisions regarding ordering, we're making decisions about whose work is more valuable and who contributed the most. And that's always challenging because when we look at what we've done in a research team, we think that we've done a lot when other people might think that we haven't done as much. So it's all a question of perception at a certain point. So when I started looking at authorship, I started looking at it like good. So if you are to distribute something within the team, it's an issue of fairness. And we can think about it like that in an ideal world. Okay, so I developed principles of fair recognition and authorship. It goes a bit like this. So authorship is built on merit based on the definition of authorship. So individuals deserve authorship in virtue of their contribution. Each individual's contribution is evaluated in the same way through an unbiased lens. So that's fair recognition. So ideally, it doesn't matter what your gender is. It doesn't matter if you're senior or if you're junior. It should be completely unbiased and based only solely on contribution. Transparency would require that all individuals should understand the meaning of authorship and its order, the process of distribution throughout the research process, as well as the outcome. So the outcome being the final decision, who's going to show up on the publication. So a lot of journals might have only one author submit the paper, and then later on we realize, oh, I didn't know I would be fifth author, or I didn't know. So there needs to be transparency with regards to such things. And also collegiality. So to get through that process, individuals should have the right to be heard, as well as the right to influence the process. So often research evolves. We have a research plan and it never goes as planned. We find things we didn't think we'd find. People leave, people go. So all of a sudden the process might change and we might need to change who is author also. So those are challenging conversations that need to take place in a collegial manner. So when I gave this type of great theoretical framework to researchers, they kind of looked at me with an awkward face saying, yeah, but I still can't talk to my PI, right? It's still challenging. So the issue is not necessarily about what is fairness or what is authorship, but also the social dynamics. And I wanted to understand those in more detail because full information about what exactly was going on. So I did a survey study to understand the more practical issues. I analyzed contextual specificities related to disagreements, ordering disagreements as well as naming disagreements. I also considered ethical issues related to such disagreements. The method used was, we pre-tested an online survey tool. We developed it with a group of experts working on authorship or science and technology studies. We created a sample of over 6,000 individual researchers, or rather over 6,000 respondents. That's the response rate. The analysis included both descriptive and multivariate logistic regressions. Results suggest that almost 50% of individuals that have published in the last 5 years had faced disagreements regarding naming defined as who is included and excluded in the research. And 37 or 38% had disagreements regarding ordering. So who should be first, second, third, last, and so forth, as well as what order should be used. We also looked at more the social positioning or the social dynamics with regards to who is or the demographics. And we found that certain individuals are more likely or less likely to be in disagreements. So individuals less likely to be in disagreements are people in multidisciplinary teams compared to individuals in disciplinary teams. Individuals in training positions are less likely to be in disagreements. That could also be because they have published less. Individuals most likely to be in disagreements, women are more likely to disagree regarding authorship with regards to men or compared to men. And individuals are in medical fields are much more likely to be in disagreements when compared to individuals from all other fields. So arts and humanities, social science, and natural sciences more broadly. So this was a little surprising to me personally, because from a purely conceptual standpoint, you would think that in multidisciplinary teams, there are all kinds of different norms and practices, and people are coming together with different ways of seeing research. And yet they are having less conflict. So that could be because they're more likely to communicate. It could be because most disciplinary teams are less likely to disagree. It could be because multidisciplinary teams sometimes have less hierarchy than disciplinary teams. We're not sure. I have not yet figured that one out for sure. We also looked at what happens after disagreements and found that after disagreements, researchers engaged in all kinds of questionable behaviors because they're upset, because they're mad, because of all kinds of reasons. So individuals disclose themselves that they had engaged in hostile behavior at 7%. So 7% of our sample who had been in disagreements engaged in some sort of hostility towards other colleagues. 4.3% undermined the work of their colleagues, and 1.8% started cutting corners. To a certain degree, I kind of expected hostility. Cutting corners I found a bit more surprising. What I found even more surprising was that 1.1% admitted to sabotaging someone else's research, and 0.8% mentioned producing fraudulent research to compete better with colleagues. Now, just to give you a better idea of what those numbers would mean, in RCR in general, so in research on FFP, falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism, generally it's 1% of researchers. So 1% of researchers would mention, or at least according to the recent literature. So if 0.8% of our sample mentioned that they had been in, so if 0.8% in disagreement engage in some sort of fraud, we can say that these disagreements are a very big predictor. Now, that doesn't mean that all disagreements will lead to that, but it means that it does increase the risk of that happening. 40% will reduce or limit further collaboration, and 50% did not perceive any misbehavior. So I will finish there because I'm really excited to go into the panel, but I do want to conclude by saying disagreements regarding authorship are very, very common. I don't want to make people think that if they're in a disagreement or if they disagree with what is happening, that it's not normal. It's completely normal. We have different ways of valuing work. We have challenging decisions to make together. However, the goal of a team is really to preserve the respect for different individuals and avoid lingering issues. At times, we need to agree to disagree. At times, there's no perfect, fair decision. At times, we need to compromise. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to go to the next thing without it festering within a team and while still keeping productivity and individual well-being. So in a way, I always say teams must really learn to ethically agree and have a safe space to do that. So I will finish there and let's go into the panel discussion.
Thank you so much. And Joanna, do you want to sort of just bring into the conversation, just like from your own perspective and your own research, how these sorts of complications related to co-authorship have come to you as a librarian?
Sure. So thank you, Dana, for that. As Dana said, I'm the Publishing and Repository Services librarian at Ohio State University Libraries. And as part of my position, I oversee both the Knowledge Bank, which is Ohio State's institutional repository, as well as our publishing program. And from that program, we publish and host about 17 journals in various subject areas, everything from humanities to sciences and more specifically medicine. And generally in my position, I work with journal editors and authors both. Usually the authors that I'm working with are students or faculty sometimes at Ohio State who are working on a publication, something they want to publish. And they at some point have a question about the publishing process. And so they'll reach out to me and request a consultation. And for me, when that happens, they usually have, it could be a variety of questions, everything from where they should be publishing, if they want to know more about the differences between open access publishing and traditional publishing. And then this is where I would usually get a question about authorship as well. And usually when that happens, I will point people to Ohio State's policy on authorship, which I have a link to that I can put in the chat. I don't know if that's going to everyone. It might just be going to certain people. So somebody wants to share it, that'd be great. But essentially, if you Google Ohio State authorship policy, for those of you who are at Ohio State, you can find it. This policy applies to all faculty, staff, and students here. And we're also, as faculty, staff, and students here, encouraged to share it with any collaborators outside of the university. And it really defines kind of the rights and responsibilities of authorship. It discusses authorship roles. It talks about unacceptable authorship practices and defining the order of authorship and kind of how to handle authorship disputes. So that's kind of a good place to start that I will use for these kind of conversations. But most often, any conversation that I'm having about authorship usually is in the context of journal editors when they encounter an issue or a problem with authorship, either with an article in a journal they're working on, or a journal that they're publishing, they're editing, or with a larger thing to do with like the whole issue, perhaps among guest editors or something like that. And they will sometimes ask my opinion for how to handle what's going on. But in addition, I also kind of generally discuss authorship with them when we're writing policies for the journals. So it can be helpful, always is helpful to make expectations about authorship in journals clear in a policy, so that if there's an issue that arises, you can point authors back to that policy. And as a publisher of journals, we also want to make sure that if a dispute about authorship or another major issue arises, we've done our due diligence to be prepared for that, as well as to ensure that our policies are ethical. and both protect and outline expectations for our journal authors. And in general, of course, we always strive to make all of our journal policies ethical, which means paying attention to developments in this area as time passes, because what we as a society and then we as academics consider ethical is always changing. So to do this, I pay attention to conversations that are happening among other library publishers, and also updates and norms that are defined by organizations like COPE, which is the Committee on Publication or on Publishing Ethics. And then lastly, I'll just conclude that in my own research and as part of my own tenure process, I also have to describe my roles and projects that I'm working on. And so I have to have these conversations with my research collaborators to discuss authorship and our roles in the process, so that we're in agreement among ourselves and are all accurately reporting our contributions to the work. And this also helps us establish expectations and make it clear who's in charge of each piece of the project, which is always helpful kind of in general.
Thank you so much. And so I think this really nicely sets up there's some surprising things, but also like even more importantly, some guidance from OSU about where to look. So let's start. I'm going to start philosophically, like as broad as possible, and then we're going to go a little bit more narrow. What does authorship mean to you? I mean, we know what it means in the regulations, but what does authorship mean to you? And I'll also ask, why should we care about authorship order in particular? So maybe we'll start with Joanna, and then we could go to Elise after that.
You know, I tend to think about this, you said like more personally, and because of my role, I tend to kind of default to policies and things like that. So, you know, I think of authorship personally as pretty broad and as inclusive of non-traditional forms of scholarship. I think sometimes those can be forgotten, you know, digital humanities projects. I think that it's important to think about, you know, it's not just the person who's writing the paper or writing this section of the paper. It's, you know, where the idea came from. It's who did the data analysis. It's, you know, it's broader and bigger than what ends up as like the exact written word on the page at the end. It's who revised it, or who, you know, all these things. And I think authorship is really just, you know, Elise mentioned fairness at the beginning, and that is the beginning of like her thought about this, right? And I think ultimately, because authorship is the way that our institutions, for better or for worse, evaluate people as part of the tenure process, or evaluate people who are not even in the tenure process as well. You know, these are the things that matter and can have impact on people's career and where it goes, whether they are, you know, in a tenure track position and trying to get tenure, or whether they are not in a tenure track position, they're a grad student or, you know, an adjunct instructor who are eventually trying to maybe land that tenure track position. The stakes are high here. And ultimately, to me, anytime I've been, you know, in the position as the lead author with other collaborators in particular, my goal is to think broadly and to step back from any kind of assumption that I'm making about this process, to be sure that I'm giving proper credit and taking different people's positions into account. You know, I'm working on a paper right now that involves, I'm a lead author, but there's another person who's a tenured faculty member, and then there are 2 staff members also working on the paper. So in that role, I'm concerned, you know, thinking about the staff people in particular, what might they not feel comfortable saying, ensuring that they're comfortable with the amount of work that they're being asked to do in particular, because it's not part of their job description in the way that it is for me.
Mm-hmm.
And ensuring that they absolutely get the credit that they deserve for the work that they are doing.
Thank you. And Elise, do you want to answer what you think authorship is?
Sure. You know, I think there's a lot of different answers that one can give to that. I think that within science, authorship is generally ideally defined as contributed, but also those who have taken responsibility for the work they have done. So, for example, if someone contributed to the experiments in the lab, doesn't matter if they did not write much, but later on, it's found that a lot of those experiments were falsified. That individual is accountable, right? So it's both credit, and often researchers go towards credit because that's often what's brought up when we're talking about funding or career, but it's also of accountability. Who's accountable for what and how accountable? So that's where our responsible conduct of research and research integrity is more linked to that aspect of accountability.
That's really interesting. I mean, later on, there's already some questions in the Q&A related to some ethical considerations, in particular about authorship order, and thinking about, like, in some ways, ranking or like ethical norms of hierarchy related to, or like who gets credit and how much, seems easier to like sort of think about than sort of hierarchical order or order of accountability, right? Like, how should we think about sort of partial ownership or partial accountability for the things that we author? I think is, I would love, we'll bracket that because that's a really interesting question. But let me just sort of talk a little bit more about best practices. So at least some of your work has been really thinking about these sorts of collaborations in interdisciplinary teams. This is something that is happening way more. And you mentioned that, you know, one of the ways we could think about ordering is just norm specific to the discipline, right? So different disciplines have their norms, and it's actually just a convention. And we should just, I mean, in some ways, one answer is, what are the ethical questions related to ordering? Well, what are the conventions, right? Things seem to be different when we start thinking about interdisciplinary work and collaborations. And so one question I have is, you know, are there best practices related to author that are generalizable across disciplines? Or do you think that there's actually something really useful about having these sort of discipline-specific ways of giving authors their due credit? So let's start with Elise, and then Joanna, if you have anything to add.
Sure. So, how can I put this? So best practices. Best practices, there are best practices that I would say will apply to every field, for sure. Things like communicate, talk about this early, have a transparent process. Now, some of that is more important in bigger, more complicated teams. If you're two people working together, you know, you might not have a huge conversation all the time, but the ideal is still to communicate about it, to make sure that individuals who contribute the most get the most credit. There's still things that apply to every field. Now, should different fields have different norms? I am not against that, simply because it is very hard to compare, let's say, a philosophy paper to a lab science paper, right? So one is all about writing and ideation and how to put the ideas together. And in the other, it's about experimentation, and, you know, writing the paper is really not that important to certain people. It's part of it, but it's not everything. So I think because of those inherent differences in how you do science, it does lead us to develop different norms of practice. And authorship norms were developed within those different fields. So I don't think that it's wrong to have specific norms within certain fields. I would say that some might highlight different contributions better. So if you have alphabetical order, even if you've worked a lot, you don't know who actually has worked a lot. So some people criticize that, while other people would say, yeah, but it makes for a better team. So I think there's benefits and faults to a lot of different orders. I think when you're in a multidisciplinary team, generally, the ideal thing to do is to decide on what order will be used at the beginning, and then the ordering of individuals will be based on the contribution. should ideally be discussed at the beginning. I know that that's not always easy for people, especially when the research keeps changing as it goes. There's some very iterative processes in research. You have these projects that can take really long time, longitudinal research also. So these are conversations that need to keep going. So the short answer is there are best practices in fields. There's best practices overall. And I would even say that there's best practices within specific research teams. And those often work really well because they are those that the team agrees to and that they decided on. So it generally fits their needs a bit better.
Do you have anything to add, Joanna?
I'll just briefly say that everything Elise has said really matches with my experience. There are definitely strong discipline-specific norms, and I don't necessarily see that as negative either, or as something that should change, or even would be possible to change, even if we thought it should. But when I work with journal editors, across different disciplines, and we talk about policies around lots of different things, including authorship, their thoughts are coming from the context of their own discipline. Whether or not they're aware of that themselves is a different question. But and things that they say, the ways that they, that they would help us know better about how the concerns they have in terms of policies are definitely, situated within their own backgrounds.
So, Elise, I'm going to push you. So you've been talking about sort of the ideal, like in the ideal, this is how we should think about sort of author order. We don't live in an ideal world, right? We live in a world where people's social positionings do sort of, whether if you're a man or a woman, whether you are a researcher in a high-income country or a low-middle-income country, where you're an English speaker versus a non-English speaker, all of these things do end up having an effect on citations and authorship order and all that stuff. So, I mean, one question I just have is just to invite both of you to sort of speak about how, one's gender, one's career status, one's sort of location influences author attribution and author order. And then the sort of follow-up question is just sort of how we should think about it, given that we know that these sociological sort of demographic features actually do sort of influence it. Should we actually be attentive to those general sort of dynamics when we're thinking about authorship order within our particular teams? And how should we kind of mitigate some of these biases? So how should we think about questions related to epistemic justice? So the justice that we owe to our team members as the experts, right? When it comes to authorship norms. And how should we think about it when we're citing other papers? So that's sort of a big question. Maybe I'll start with Joanna, and then Elise, you could go afterwards.
Sure. So I think that this is possibly the most kind of difficult aspect of ethical authorship, particularly if you're the person who's in the less powerful position. I think in general, it's definitely worth kind of challenging all authorship norms and thinking about them critically at a higher level. In my own experience as an author, I have not personally encountered any major ethical issues with my collaborators, but I also know that if I did, as a junior faculty member who's also a woman, I wouldn't necessarily feel like I could speak up, or that I should speak up, or that it would be, the cost of speaking up would be kind of worth it in case it limited my ability to collaborate in the future. I don't mean to suggest that I don't have my own privileges. I'm in North America for one, I'm white for another, but I do think that anytime you feel that you're not, I don't know, the one in a powerful position, you're not the one in the powerful position, basically. Where I really have felt empowered personally is just in my job. So in my role as the librarian who runs the publishing program and at the libraries, I feel more empowered there to work toward getting people like the journal editors that I work with to kind of think about these issues, as well as other social justice issues in the context of the work that they're doing. And my hope is that this will result in policies and practices that at least encourage change where I think it's needed. So that's where I felt like more empowered and myself, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for putting that hard question right in front of me. So I would say, as Joanna mentioned, this is probably one of the questions we struggle with the most, especially at the moment. So there's two questions, right? So first, how does positionality impact authorship? So I will go straight towards the evidence on this one. So evidence suggests that everything with regards to position, or a lot of things, will influence authorship distribution. There's a fantastic article that just came out probably 2 months ago by Douglas in Accountability and Research. And they look at 3 different dynamics of fairness. They look at the outcome of distribution. They look at the information people had to make that distribution. And I believe they look at fairness of process, if I remember well. And they also looked at what influenced the perception of fairness. And the research clearly demonstrated that the more underrepresented you are, so the more you are, let's say, if you are a person of color, if you are disabled, if you are a person not living in the US or on a visa, so all these things, if you are LGBTQ, the more underrepresented you are, the less likely you will be in what you consider to be a fair position. So those individuals are more likely to see more if they didn't have the information they needed to make decisions. They also demonstrate very clearly that individuals in more power perceive fairness everywhere, or they think that they have a great authorship climate and that everything is great, while others do not. And that is not necessarily something of ill intent, right? So sometimes it might seem like the PI is the bad person. That's really not the case. So the PI sometimes is just doing what they were taught to do. And it's a very different climate now than it was, let's say, 20 years ago, right? It's a more diverse situation. Individuals contribute in different ways, and they see things in different ways based on how they were raised, based on what they've learned, based on their experience in academia, and so on and so forth. So the research is fairly clear as to individuals in underrepresented groups are more likely to feel that things are unfair. Research also shows that people communicate differently. People talk about authorship at different times. So, for example, women will talk about authorship earlier than men will, which might be the reason why they end up in conflicts more often or disagreements more often, right? Based on gender, certain genders will also value different contributions more. So our research showed that men are more likely to value technical contributions, whereas women are more likely to value writing or leadership positions. So that was so if different genders even view different contributions as more or less important, we're starting on a completely different, by viewing authorship in a different way, which means you really need to communicate through those things. And even your communication style will be different. So there's all kinds of differences that we need to manage more now than we ever did, because teams are growing, because we have more diverse teams, because we're starting to really talk about this more, and it's becoming an issue of significant concern. So what to do about it? So of course we can talk about it. I do want to, so some people have argued or have suggested, if there's people that are underrepresented, give them more credit even if they don't contribute. And I would say that that's definitely a horrible idea. It's a horrible idea because then they will be treated as an expert in a field that they don't have expertise in. And that will be probably problematic down the line. So I would say it is great to give individuals opportunities to contribute and a lot of opportunities so that they can contribute. But I wouldn't say to go into unethical authorship issues to fix issues of systemic justice, for example. And I would say that we still have a lot of work to do about how to manage differences in a better way. Citation, there's research on citation that has come out where we should be looking at who we are citing and seeing if we are citing a diverse group of individuals. Now, if your field does not at all have a diverse group of individuals, let's say you're in math, which is not very diverse at the moment, you're not going to create an individual that doesn't exist for your citation, right? But if you are in a field where there is more diversity, it's important to cite that. So you can have that in the authorship realm, and I'm sure that everyone, especially in library sciences, can definitely help you create more diverse references. I know that even in syllabi, we're trying to push towards a more diverse reading material so that also is reflected in our research.
Thank you. So there's a lot of questions that are, coming in. So I'm going to start asking questions from the audience. Some of them I'm going to pair together. So there's some questions, one from David Resnick and one from Cindy Moore, about how to sort of operationalize or mitigate against some of these issues. So David Resnick asked, do you think something like whistleblower protections should be extended to people who claim that they have not received proper credit? I'm concerned about students and trainees who may fear retaliation if they bring up authorship issues, the kinds of dynamics that we've been talking about so far. And Cindy Moore asks, is there, on a more proactive level, is there a standard form that shows criteria for authorship, like an algorithm or a checklist that you would recommend that has been successful in teams? So maybe we'll start with Elise, and then Joanna, if you could add your own thoughts.
I apologize. So with regards to protections and whistleblowers, so students will often ask that, like, are there protections for me if I want to mention that my PI is not doing things fairly, or so that there's no retribution? And I mean, that is a possibility. I'm not against that, but I do want to be realistic in that the research world is very small. And even if we try to protect confidentiality as much as possible, there will probably be some negative outcomes. So when people come see me and talk about an issue that's very problematic, we'll go through options. So option A, do nothing, which is probably not the option that they want if they're coming to see me. Option B, try to talk about it in this way. Option C, try to go through it. So there's more than one option, and we would try a few before opting towards, whistleblower type protections. I do think that most institutions do have certain protections. They do have RIOs, they do have, and research integrity generally don't look at authorship, but more and more they tend to start. They're not supposed to, but they do. Some of them do. With regards to checklists, so there are checklists out there. I actually believe that I just opened Ohio's policy has a checklist linked to different contributions. So who did the conceptualization, data curation, formal analysis? Now, the second question is, do they work? I would say that things like for authorship contracts are good to communicate who is doing what. So instead of thinking that everyone knows who is doing what, by putting it on paper or talking about it, forces you to talk about it. Now, it doesn't make it clear what is more valuable. It doesn't make authorship order necessarily clear, because you could decide on something at the beginning and it could change throughout. So I would say, yes, you can use them if it helps your team. And research has shown that it does help in communication. But the research seems to be unclear if it actually makes people feel that the process is more fair or not. The research is very slim on that. So I would say use it, but it's not, just because you use those tools does not mean you have a fair outcome. Use it as a tool, not a guarantee of fairness.
Thank you. Joanna?
Yeah. Yes, I agree with Elise. I think in terms of like the whistleblower half of the question, from a practical perspective, I don't know how you would do that outside of, the protections that Elise mentioned that are kind of already in place. And I think it would be worse to kind of make promises that there will be safety and anonymity that can't ultimately be delivered on. I think that this is, Elise also mentioned the research world is small. I think that there's just an inherent risk here, even though that's uncomfortable. I don't know how to remove that in any real way. And then in terms of like an algorithm or something to use in terms of authorship, I also agree things like the Ohio State authorship policy, or things that have, I've seen various organizations and even some publishers have created documents along authorship or how they think about it, or ways to talk about it. It's maybe helpful to kind of lean on something like that that's created by a third party. That might help with some of like the awkwardness of the discussion. Like we're just going to follow this questionnaire that my institution says I should be following, feels a little bit more comfortable than saying like, I'm deeply disconcerted about how we're going to actually cooperate and agree on this, it can give you a good neutral sort of ground to start with. But I definitely also agree with Elise that, the tool doesn't make things fair. The people do who are using the tool.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to think about. I mean, part of what you've been saying, Elise, and Joanna, is like, in some ways, the process changes. So thinking about certain things as this sort of like fixed contract or the silver bullet that is going to like solve and resolve all these issues is just not only unrealistic, but can actually lead to real unfairness down the line, because we should just be open to the process actually changing who gets what sorts of credit for what work that is done. And so another set of questions that came out, and I just put in the chat for one scorecard that has been talked about in past Center for Ethics and Human Values care panels, that is like a scorecard determination. So use it as a tool, but I really do buy this idea from Elisa and Joanna that this is not necessarily going to resolve all issues. So Barbara Kalautzik and Regrisa Kaba talked, sort of one question is like to invite you to talk a little bit more about the power dynamics and the ethical issues that come up when we're doing these sort of more international research collaborations between high income countries, researchers in high income countries and lower and middle income countries, especially when some co-authors are not native English speakers, even though that's sort of the predominant journals that are most highly sort of credited and cited are English language journals. So how do we navigate specifically those issues of international collaboration in a fair and equitable way? I'll start with Elise, and Joanna, if you have any thoughts to add, I would be grateful.
Great, yeah. So thank you for that question. So international collaborations are really interesting because of the diversity of input that you couldn't come up with, right? So if you are going into a low to middle income country, you are generally collaborating with people in the field. You And if you are from a high-income country going into a low-income country working on global health, for example, you would not be able to do that research for it, not for those collaborations. You would not be able to collect that data for it, not for that individual going to communicate with whoever you need to communicate on the ground. You would not have access to institutional support there. So when individuals from high-income countries said, yeah, but I wrote the whole paper, we need to remember that the research is not just the paper. And the research is also, or the contribution is also the value of different tasks being put in to that innovation process. And one could argue that data collection in that context is worth a lot, probably more than even the writing, because you could not do it otherwise. And it would be very hard to do it otherwise. You would not be able to do the research you are doing. Now, with regards to the language issue, which is a bit of a different issue, obviously you will not ask someone who does not read English or write English to write an English article. Like that would just be ridiculous. Now, you can share your information or what is in the article with that individual to make sure it is accurate, it is correct, and it reflects what is being done on the floor, on the ground, in practice, to make sure that you are on the same page. The reason why we ask people to read over the draft is to make sure everyone thinks that what has been done is accurate. So if you could do that in a different way, which is not necessarily reading the manuscript, but sharing or communicating it in a different way, I believe you will get to the same outcome or the same meaning of that task. So the short answer is, in those complex collaborations, you need to look at the value of the contribution being made and not think about it as you would just in a typical US context.
Joanna, do you have any other thoughts on that? How to navigate those kinds of collaborations?
Sure. Just to speak from kind of the journal publisher perspective, in this kind of case, we try to encourage open-mindedness among journal editors, as well as to be flexible ourselves and allow researchers who may be on teams who speak different languages to publish the article in multiple languages. So we have several times published, and we always need an English language an English language version, because the journals are categoried and indexed in that way. But if they want to publish, we've done it in Portuguese, had additional versions available in those languages, which allow further reach in those countries. Also, where people who are researchers there may also not be the best English speakers or not be English speakers at all, so that they're included in that. The only thing is that we can't then, because we don't have multiple language speakers among our staff, so if someone's publishing in Portuguese, we can't look through it the same way that we can if it is in English. So that's the thing, the caveat that we have. But we try to be open-minded ourselves as publishers, as well as encourage the journal editors to have that open-mindedness as well in situations where that would be helpful or make sense.
So we have about 6 minutes left, and I think we have enough time to ask 2 more questions, if that's all right with you. So the first of those 2 questions are thinking about, given the sorts of constraints and challenges that come with co-authorship, Donal and Mithuna asks, can you comment on how the hiring, tenure, and promotion processes contribute to the importance of giving author order? And how could these processes of tenure and promotion and hiring help promote more ethical approaches to authorship? Joanna, maybe we'll start with you, and then Elise, you could go second.
I think this is hugely important. I think that there are many things about the tenure promotion process that could and should be thought of at a higher level in terms of fairness and equity and all of these issues, not just authorship. I think that because authorship is, as I kind of said earlier, the main one of the main ways that people are evaluated when they're on tenure track, or if they're trying to get a tenure track position, they're trying to show that they can be successful in a tenure track position. That creates this environment that's not always as focused on fairness or equity, or it doesn't necessarily encourage an environment where people are looking out for others as much as maybe they're looking out for themselves. And I think that that's just not, it's just not ideal. We have all kinds of systems in the world that I think are flawed, obviously, but I think that this one in particular does not necessarily do us favors. I understand some of why it's in place, but it's so easy to get twisted in terms of how we're treating other people. It's easy sometimes to get lost in it. And instead of letting it measure what we're doing, to try to, it's a bit of a game. It can be a game. And we all have to play it. All the tenure track folk, or the folk who want to be tenure track, have to play it to a degree. But it is not always comfortable. I don't know that I have more to add than that, really.
Thank you. And Elise, do you have any thoughts on how to sort of make a hiring and tenure promotion and promotion sort of process that at least facilitates ethical authorship practices?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a challenging one for various reasons. So first, tenure and promotion is different at different institutions and different fields. At some institutions, they say like, you need to publish X amount, 50 articles for, like it's very specific. At other schools, it says, oh, get to a level of excellence, and that's not really defined because there's people from different fields. For a long time, they valued mainly articles first and last author. Recently, I heard that more and more schools are valuing first, second, and last. So I feel like norms are changing. With COVID-19, tenure clocks stopped at various institutions for a year because it was brought to light that things were just unfair. And I think that kind of opened up a discussion as to like, maybe systemically things are not fair with regards to tenure. And I think that's a different conversation, because authorship is one thing, and I would actually argue that maybe it's worth a bit too much in tenure, because there are some people that are amazing scholars that do more community outreach, that do different types of publications or knowledge disseminations that are as important as high impact peer review published work. So I feel like there's at least a discussion about what is the value of different types of contribution. If knowledge development is not only writing in publications, but also creating better health outcomes or creator humanities knowledge, like all these things can be done in different ways. And I think there's this thought that we should do things differently. So I think that if we manage to look at tenure in a bit of a broader way, it could take a bit of pressure off this authorship criteria, because at the moment there's too much riding on too little a space. That's my personal opinion. It might not be everyone's, but it's my opinion at this point.
I agree. I just want to say one more thing. I think that there are many ways to be successful as an academic, and I don't think that that's necessarily recognized by the tenure process.
Well, I think that is actually our time. So thank you so much for our two panelists, for Elise and Joanna, for coming, sharing both your expertise, but also your experiences. I really appreciate it. And for those who are watching, this is recorded. The panel is going to be posted on the Center for Ethics and Human Values website, probably at the end of this week. So please look to that and look to next semester's CARE panels. We're organizing them as we speak, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year. Thank you again, everyone.